then there was some suggestion that their sister Elizabeth would be used as a sort of a bride for a potential Catholic groom, so they would become king and queen of England. So I suppose it would have been a sort of reverse of the Glorious Revolution. You would have had a Stuart married to a Catholic rather than a monarch, rather than the other way around.
Remember the 5th of November, Gunpowder Treason and Plot, for I see no reason why gunpowder and treason should ever be forgot. Hello and welcome to the pod, and of course with tomorrow being Bonfire Night to commemorate the 1605 plot to blow up King James I and Parliament with him, I just had to get an acclaimed historian on to chat about it, and that historian is Leanda de Lisle. She joins me to chat about what the plan was had it been successful, and then we go on to talk about the Stuarts from Mary Queen of Scots down to James II. Leanda is the author of Henrietta Maria, which is currently on a 99p Kindle deal, and that's an obscene bargain. Link is in the show notes. Plenty more great history to come, including Winston Churchill, an SAS Origins showdown with two historians of the unit, and our Great British Commanders series continues with Field Marshal Haig of World War I. Was he Butcher Haig or a national hero? Please do rate, review and share with the like-minded, but until then I'll hand you over to me talking with Leanda de Lisle on the Gunpowder Plot and the Stuarts. Leanda de Lisle, welcome back to the podcast. Great pleasure to have you back on. Thank you.
It's brilliant to be back on.
Right, last time you joined me, we were talking about Henrietta Maria because she's the subject of your new book. And well, it's new, it's been out a year, but it's newly
just out in paperback. Yeah, that's
yes.
right, just out in paperback.
Great stuff. And so what I thought today would be quite fun is just to do a bit of a overview of just a kind of greatest hits of the Stuarts, really, because it's a family, a dynasty that is, I suppose in the last sort of 20, 30 years, maybe slightly overshadowed by the Tudors.
Very much so, I think, yes.
Yes, and I think very unfairly, I find them eminently fascinating. And so I thought we could kick off a little bit with, well, we're speaking on the 2nd of November. Obviously, in 3 days' time is Bonfire Night, commemorating the Gunpowder Plot. So I thought we'd kick off with James I, son of Mary Queen of Scots. He's King of England, King of Scotland, James the Sixth of Scotland, First of England, Gunpowder Plot. And probably most people know the story of Guy Fawkes attempting to blow everyone up. But I wanted to delve into that a little bit more in the scenario. Let's assume Fawkes succeeded and James I is killed. I mean, for a start, it would have been hugely... the numbers killed would have been vast. But what do you think would have happened, in the aftermath?
Well, the situation might have been quite chaotic. There could have been a civil war. I suppose it also depends who'd survived, because James's eldest son, Prince Henry, was also due to be in Parliament with him. So I think the plotters assumed that they would both be killed. Poor old Charles, who was 5 years old, he would have been still alive. I think he was rather sort of sickly. And they had planned, which was rather grotesque, or one of them had planned to just stab him a bit, age 5, so that he couldn't be moved out of London. I mean, quite grotesque. Just a little bit of a stabbing.
Any more detail on where? I mean, cut his tendons?
No, I don't think they specified the exact spots, but I think they were just sort of thinking, so that he can't be moved. And then there was some suggestion that their sister Elizabeth would be used as a sort of a bride for a potential, I suppose, Catholic groom, so they would become king and queen of England. So I suppose it would have been a sort of reverse of the Glorious Revolution. You would have had a Stuart married to a Catholic rather than a monarch, rather than the other way around.
But presumably most of the European monarchies would have been in outrage. I
think they would have been outraged. I don't think the Gunpowder Plotters thought it through, really. I'm sure they would have been completely outraged. And of course, only a few years later, Henrietta Maria's father, Henri IV, was in fact assassinated. He was a Catholic, but he was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic who was sort of loopy, actually, as assassins often are, I think. And yes, I'm sure they would have been appalled. I don't think it would have done their cause any good at all. But they were, I suppose, incredibly bitter. James, before he became King of England, had raised great hopes amongst Catholics. Well, he raised great hopes amongst all sorts of people. Anyone really, basically, thought you could help. So he assured Catholics that he would end the persecution of Catholics in England, and they believed he would introduce a sort of freedom of religion. So you could be a Protestant or a Catholic in England, as indeed you could in France. But this didn't happen. As soon as he became king, he on his journey south, he released prisoners in the towns he passed through, accepting murderers and Catholics. So Catholics began to realize this, he was not going to fulfill his promises. And indeed, one of the plotters, the future plotters, was very struck by an event that happened when I think there was some gunpowder that was stored on the Thames, place beginning with R, I can't remember what it was now, and it blew up. This was in 1603 when James became King of England, and that began to give him ideas about how he was going to dispose of the entire elite. Really, that's what he wanted. That's what they wanted to do. Clean slate was the plan.
Yeah, it would have been. I mean, hundreds killed of the elites. It just doesn't bear. Well, I mean, it's quite intriguing to wonder where that would end. I mean, it's impossible to think where we would go.
I suppose the IRA tried the same thing, didn't they, in a way, in Brighton when they blew up. I suppose that was just a Conservative Party, but nevertheless, but they were the government of the day, weren't they? And when they blew up that hotel in Brighton.
Yeah, we don't tend to assassinate our leaders, really. I get Spencer Perceval, I think, is the only...
Spencer Perceval. Well, yes, no, we're less violent often than our European contemporaries in Britain.
Yeah, and of course, we're speaking in November, the 60th anniversary of JFK's assassination, and
another nutter.
Yes. Well, yeah, I'm rather intrigued, but I'm going to be, that'll be on our film club this month, and I'm very interested in talking about the conspiracy behind that. I'm convinced this one, for fear of sounding like a nutter. Anyway, back on topic.
Yes.
So you mentioned Henrietta Maria there, and her father Henri IV. He was Henri of Navarre, wasn't he? Because he started out as a Protestant.
He did, yes, absolutely. And there's the apocryphal story that he converted because Paris was largely Catholic, and that he said Paris was worth a mass, and so converted. But he introduced these edicts, the Edicts of Nantes, which meant that both Protestants and Catholics could practice their religion in France, which obviously they were unable to do in England, where Catholics remained persecuted.
But in France, you had the wars of religion and the famously the Bartholomew Day massacre, when Protestants were slaughtered.
Well, absolutely. Yes, and again, they sort of went in for that a bit in Europe, slaughtering people in massacres, which happily we didn't do. I think there were a few Catholics killed at the time of the Armada, but nothing on that sort of scale.
But why is that? Because if Catholics in this country were not treated equally, what was the lot of the Catholics? I mean, it wasn't so bad that we didn't descend into civil wars. I guess we didn't.
No, I think it's because it took place quite slowly over a long period of time, all of Elizabeth's reign, really. And before then, of course, I mean, it began with sort of Henry VIII, and then although he didn't introduce Protestantism, he was more schismatic, I suppose. But then Edward VI, and you had a brief period under Mary where Catholicism was restored. And then you had over 40 years or whatever it was under Elizabeth. And so there were actually very few Catholics by the time James came along, and they weren't obviously didn't really pose a big threat in England. But I think Protestants in England, understandably, nevertheless, felt they were a threat. And the reason for that was that, England had not been Protestant for very long, so it had quite shallow roots still. And secondly, that the Reformation was being sort of rolled back in Europe by the Counter-Reformation, and Protestantism was losing ground, both to military forces Catholic military forces under the Habsburgs in particular, and also to the Catholic revival, which is known both as the Catholic revival and less positively as the Counter-Reformation. And so they felt, that British Protestantism was threatened by resurgent European Catholicism, and that Catholics in Britain were a sort of fifth column, basically.
So after the Gunpowder Plot, then life becomes more difficult for Catholics, doesn't it, under James
Well,
I?
it did. But interestingly, James was rather less bothered about Catholics and the threat that they posed than many of his Protestant subjects. And he was really not very keen on celebrating November the 5th at all. He wanted to celebrate another event which took place in August in 1600, so 3 years before he became King of England, in Scotland, when he was kidnapped. Well, he said that, and there may indeed have been a kidnap attempt by two Calvinist Scottish aristocrats who were murdered, or not were murdered, but were killed in the course of this attempted kidnap. And that was celebrated by James every year. When he arrived in England, he was determined that this would be celebrated. And it was celebrated at court because he insisted on it. His being saved from these terrible Gowrie brothers, Riven brothers. I mean, the family name was Riven, the title was Gowrie. So he was rather disappointed that the English insisted on celebrating November the 5th. And so what about the Gowries? What about the Gowries? No one in England cared about the Gowries. But anyway.
Yeah, if it didn't happen in London, it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And also they were the wrong religion because they were Calvinists, the Riven brothers. So they didn't really want to remember they didn't want to remember Calvinist treason. They only wanted to remember Catholic treason.
You mentioned, I think, Henry, the heir to the throne, who would have gone up in smoke along with his father, but he did actually die young, and he was the sort of great hope as well, wasn't he?
Yes, although one wonders how much of that was retrospective. Yes, he was the great hope. I mean, James was a very clever man, a very clever king, a brilliant king. So
a brilliant king.
Yeah, he was a brilliant king. He was probably the sort of greatest ever king, Scots, but less successful as King of England. But remember, he died in his bed, unlike his son. Anyway, going back, what was that? I can't remember what I was saying now. What were we talking about?
Henry.
Oh, Henry. Oh, yes, Henry being the great. Yeah. So what James did is, for example, his wife, Anne, was possibly a Catholic convert. And so he sort of encouraged her to have Catholic friends and things, particularly in Scotland, which sort of encouraged Catholic hopes in him. And then with Henry, he allowed Henry to be surrounded by the people of the more sort of Calvinist end of the Church of England, and sort of to give them hope and make sure that they were all happy as well. And so Henry was surrounded by these people, and he thought he'd be their man, I suppose, when he became king. But the truth is, he died at 18, I think he was, and he died too young before he had a chance to disappoint anybody's hopes. He could have been anything. Who knows what might have happened? After he died, his memory was really used as a stick to beat Charles with, in the same way that Elizabeth's memory, the memory of Elizabeth I, was used as a stick to beat James with. I mean, the people who attacked James, who often came from this kind of people who had supported the Earl of Essex, Elizabeth's last favourite, Robert Devereux, in the 1590s, were then anti-James. And of course, the truth was that Essex had his head chopped off as a traitor because he had attempted to lead a palace coup against Elizabeth. So actually, they weren't so enamored with Elizabeth before she died. No, then suddenly they're frightfully enamored with Elizabeth after she's safely dead. And they can use her glorious nationalist Protestant memory as a stick to beat and sort of supposedly aggressive, warlike figure against the terrible sort of peacenik James, who wanted peace with Spain, for example.
Well, so James did die in his bed, as
he
you
did
said.
Indeed, yeah.
So how influential was his belief?
And he wasn't murdered, by the way.
Oh, is there a rumor that he was murdered?
Well, there was, the Spanish at the time put out a sort of black propaganda saying that he had been murdered by the Duke of Buckingham. This, I think, is about I think Netflix or one of these programs is about to do a series about Buckingham and his and I think they will be saying that, oh yes, Buckingham murdered James. So just forewarned, folks. Buckingham did not murder James. James was not murdered.
These rumours always seem so far-fetched anyway, don't they?
Oh, they
like the princes in the tower. It seems pretty obvious who's ultimately responsible.
I would think so. Yes, I would agree with you there. By which we mean Richard III, clearly.
Yes. I don't want the Richard III Society people on me though. So
no, I know. I think that's why people are quite sort of careful. But frankly, yes, of course it was. Of course, Richard was behind it.
Yes. So yes, James is died in his bed.
Yeah.
But was he divine right of kings is always the phrase that's used in association with Charles I when we talk about the Civil War. Was James I very much a believer in that as well? And so let's assume he lived another 30 years.
He was more than very much a believer in that as well. He wrote the book.
So therefore,
James wrote the book.
He laid the groundwork for the Civil War.
Well, that's a different. That's not quite the state. That's conflating two things. No, this is one of the interesting. I find fascinating. People think, oh yes, no, Charles, divine right of kings. He must have got this idea from France and from Henrietta Maria. No, absolutely not. James wrote the book. James, and it was very, and I may say it was also very distinctly Protestant, because the divine right of kings, as James described it, meant the kings they should obey the law, but they were above the law, and they were also above the Pope. They were in charge not only of their subjects' bodies, but also their souls. And this is why kings of England were heads of or governors of the Church of England. So yes, divine right of kings, on which James wrote about extensively, and that Charles simply followed his father's beliefs. Did James cause a civil war? No. I mean, the reason for the divine, one of the reasons that James wrote about the divine right of kings was that after the Reformation, people began to argue that it was possible, that it was right and possible to assassinate a monarch who was of the wrong religion. So Catholics could use this to assassinate Protestant monarchs, and Protestants could use this to assassinate Catholic monarchs. James, who had no desire to be assassinated by anyone, said, no, only God can punish a king. So even if they follow what you may or may not conceive to be the wrong religion, you have to leave God to do it. You can't just take it into your own hands. Did that cause a civil war? No, I think lots of different factors caused the Civil War. I mean, I'm afraid to say where James was extremely canny, a canny Scot, Charles was not. Charles was not a good reader of men. He was weak when he should have been strong. He was unbending when he should have been flexible. So yeah, it wasn't the divine right of kings on its own that caused the Civil War. It was Charles's political ineptitude, I'm afraid.
As you say, James believed that kings should obey the law, but were also above the law.
Yes.
Did he acknowledge that there's a little bit of a contradiction there? Because
because he believed in the next life, and if you disobey God, you're going to go to hell and roast for all eternity, and indeed are predestined to do so. So I don't think so. You should aspire to do the right thing, but no one has the right. I suppose if you think of it in today's terms, we may not agree with what the Prime Minister of the country does, but that doesn't give us a right to murder him or her.
No, but what I'm getting at is that if you're the monarch and you believe that you should obey the law, quite rightly, but also that you're above the law, I
see what you're getting at. Well, I suppose what you see, the law is sort of guidelines rather than prescriptive. So, I mean, you are the law to some extent. I mean, you follow the right religion. I mean, you might not, in which case God will punish you. I think that's the point. So, yes, I mean, you should obey the law just as you should obey God, but people don't always do the right thing. But that was his view. So I think it makes perfect sense. You can be all powerful, but that doesn't mean that you should behave wickedly.
Charles obviously was an important factor in the Civil War.
Yeah.
He's a bit of a disaster. I know you've written a very well regarded book, The White King.
Thank you.
So you have a slight. That's sympathetic to Charles, isn't it?
Yes, I did. I mean, I thought it needed. I felt as well that there needed to be a sort of corrective to all the negative stuff about Charles. He wasn't. He wasn't an idiot. It makes the whole Civil War so much less interesting if he's just sort of made out to be some sort of useless Burke. I mean, he really wasn't, and he had many qualities. He was a good man. He just wasn't a good king. And, he actually had strengths. He actually turned out to be quite a good military commander, a good leader in times of war. He wasn't good at playing politics. He was good at being a sort of party leader rather than a king. As a king, you do need to bring people together. And Charles found it very difficult to read people, and that made him very defensive. And he also, interestingly, I mean, he lacked ruthlessness as well. I mean, his enemies were quite happy to go around killing people and chopping off heads. Charles didn't. I mean, yes, he did chop off the ears of sort of disobedient Puritans, but during the period when he ruled without parliament, no one was executed for religious reasons on either side of the religious divide. And Charles did, yes. So he's a very interesting man, as I said, with many different sides to him, and I tried to give a sort of rounded picture rather than a sort of caricature.
And when he was executed, the way he acted, it was it draws sympathy now, but that was almost his finest hour, wasn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, he died very bravely. He was quite clever in that he had prepared this work of propaganda, which sort of justified everything he had done in his reign and damned his enemies, and so that people were able to launch this idea of him as a royal martyr who had died for the law, amongst other things, and for the Church of England as his father left it. As opposed to how the Puritans wanted it, without bishops and so forth. He did also say very clearly on the scaffold that he still believed in the divine right of kings. And interestingly, there's a lot of sort of talk about, there's also some belief that, Henrietta Maria changed him somehow, that she sort of made him more extreme or whatever, all of which is completely untrue. And I think what's very evident from his scaffold speech is that that he was exactly the same man on the scaffold as the 25-year-old king that she met when she was 15 in 1625.
Well, Henrietta Maria, so she spends the interregnum abroad in France, doesn't she? But she's mother of 2 kings of England.
Yes.
And Scotland. And her daughter married I'm going to get this wrong now.
Orange.
Yes, and therefore she's grandmother of William III, obviously grandmother of Mary as well then.
Yes.
So that's quite a CV, as it were. And I was just interested in her after the Restoration, because Charles II, I'm taking the rather kind of blunt instrument of Charles II, okay king, James II, crap, Mary, good, and William, good.
Well, I think that very much depends.
Right. Yes, I suppose it does. But Charles II and James II, did they have Henrietta Maria as counsel? Because she'd been through a huge amount, obviously the Civil War, and had been queen of England for a long time.
Yes, I think people forget that she lived for sort of nearly 20 years after Charles's execution, and these were very full and interesting years. Up until 1660, because you say that she was in exile, and she took on a kind of sort of new persona, I think, after Charles I was executed, because she realized that she was going to be the person who was going to most easily be able to raise money and military help for her son, Charles II. And she took on this kind of persona of the Catholic persona of Our Lady of Sorrows, I think, which is very important in sort of Catholic culture, and is, the Virgin whose son Christ dies on the cross. And of course, she'd lost a king as well in her husband Charles, and she wore black. Of course, she had very little money, and it also helped disguise the fact she had little money, because you couldn't, you were supposed to appear at courts covered in diamonds and pearls and looking amazing, to show how important you were. And she needed to show that she was important as the Queen Dowager, but she didn't have the jewels links because she had to flog them all. And so she wore black, and she took on this persona of a Queen of Sorrows, which allowed her to get away with that, would still be a very powerful figure without actually being sort of having a sort of enormous diamond nose stud every day or whatever. Anyway, so with her children, she was a very strong character. So were they, both James and Charles, and they would argue frequently about best way forward. Notably, she argued furiously with Charles II about his youngest brother, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who had been a prisoner throughout the Civil War of Parliament. And then after Charles I's execution, he was eventually sent over to France. And Henrietta Maria wanted to convert him to Catholicism. And she explained, this is sort of, people say, this is because she was a terrible sort of fanatic. But actually, there were very practical reasons for it. The Stuart cause was at a very low ebb. And she said to Charles II, look, I don't want him to end up like you, basically, with no money and no power and nothing. And if he's a Catholic, he can marry a rich Catholic princess, or he can be made a cardinal, or, he can have a good life. As well, of course, naturally, she also believed it was the right religion. Of course she did. And she and Charles II quarreled furiously about that. Henry had no intention of converting. He had sat on his father's knee just before, sort of day before his father was executed. And his father had explained to him that he was dying for the Protestant Church of England and to obey his mother in all things save religion. So young Henry was not going to convert. And Henrietta Maria was extremely annoyed about that. But again, there was a practical reason for this. It wasn't just because she was being a bitch. If you were in her position, you could not afford to have your young son disobey you. You had to appear powerful. She was, as I said, a very important figure to draw European and particularly French support for Charles II. And so she kicked her youngest son out of her house. And people forget that Charles I's sister, Elizabeth the Winter Queen, who was a Protestant, did exactly this, and who was also an exiled queen, in a very similar situation to Henrietta Maria, did exactly the same thing with two of her children who converted to Catholicism. No speakers. That's what happened. It's not about just being, an annoying person or whatever. But anyway, so she would have flaming rows with her children. That did not mean she did not love them, and they did not love her. They certainly did. But she certainly didn't rule their minds. Both Charles and James had very independent minds and went their own way. And I don't believe that James II's eventual conversion to Catholicism had much to do with his mother, to be honest. First of all, his wife converted before he did. And yes, there were various reasons. Don't forget, he'd spent, he'd spent a decade or whatever in Catholic Europe. I don't think it was much to do with his mother. Was she an advisor when she came back after the Restoration? No. Charles didn't need his mother's advice, but she did become again a very powerful figure. So the usual image we're given of her after her return is that she's, people quote the diarist Samuel Pepys describing her. She's just got back and she's dressed in black and looking miserable. And he says she's looking very ordinary. The fact is, her youngest son, Henry, the one we were just talking about, had just died. And she was
smallpox, wasn't it?
Yes. And she was heartbroken because she was hoping they were all going to get together. She'd written letters saying, hooray, we're all going to get together again. Marvellous. Of course, she didn't have to pretend to not to be on speakers with him now because Charles II was king. And so she was devastated. And so, understandably, she wasn't looking at her perkiest with her son just dead. And what they don't quote is Samuel Pepys, same man, writing 2 years later, saying, she had the greatest court, full of the most mirth, that was merrier than that of the merry monarch Charles II. And she was living her best life and was again very powerful. She had revived her Catholic chapel at Somerset House. was again buying works of art and was doing a lot of things that she had done before the Civil War. So yes, that's actually one of the reasons I call her the Phoenix Queen, because which was a term that was used at the time, and she had sort of risen from the ashes of the Civil War really, and was again a great queen.
You mentioned that they were living in, well, I guess it wouldn't have been poverty, but they didn't have oodles of money in France. Why weren't they able to take out a few chests of gold and live in?
Well, they did, but they'd worked their way through it. I mean, Henrietta Maria raised enormous sums of money during the Civil War, but she didn't use this to deck herself out. I mean, she used it to pay for arms and men, and she was bankrolled Charles I. She bankrolled the Civil War. Was what she was for the Royalists, and she was extremely a successful asset. Of course, she wanted to bankroll Charles II too, but it was becoming more and more difficult. France made an alliance with Cromwell. Even Spain made an alliance with Cromwell.
What did she think then? Because
she was horrified. I mean, she said it when Louis XIV did. She said, it was the worst thing that had happened to her since Charles I's execution. I mean, she was devastated. And her sister-in-law, Louis XIV's mother, sent her a sort of lovely bale of silver tissue or whatever to cheer her up, sort of fabric, silver tissue. And I think it stayed sort of stuffed in a cupboard. She was very, very angry and very distressed, and was determined to make them all feel bad about it, which she jolly well did, stomping around dressed in black, saying, look at me, Our Lady of Sorrows.
But it's interesting that because jumping forward a bit, when Napoleon proclaims himself, just a little bit, proclaims himself emperor, all the other monarchies, they hate Napoleon, the usurper. And yet Cromwell, they're rushing to sign treaties with him.
Oh, I think they hated him, but realpolitik and all that. I mean, if you look at China now, it's persecuting its Muslim minority.
Absolutely.
and it's condemning Israel for what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. I mean, so it's hypocrisy. It's realpolitik.
Yes, indeed. Well, okay. So Charles II, we had a long chat with Charles Spencer about Charles II, who he came to the view that, he's criticized, but really, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, Charles II, having seen his father's experience, didn't want to stir things up and had a sort of relatively quiet reign.
I think we underestimate how incredibly damaged Charles II and James II were by their experiences in the Civil War and after. Well, the Civil Wars. Charles was, I think, about 10. I think when he had to go to the House of Lords and beg for the life of, the Earl of Strafford, his father's servant, who was executed. There were terrible experiences. He was in battle still as a little boy. I think James was 9 at Edge Hill, where they saw people killed, blown to pieces in front of them, and they were hidden with the injured. You can imagine what's that like? If you're a small child, the screaming, the dying, and that's just one incident. And then the horror of your father being executed. These men were traumatized and damaged. They had the humiliation, having had a sort of lovely time until he was 10 or whatever. They then had, the humiliation of poverty, of, possibly having to marry some terrible, princess who didn't like him and was sniffy, and, having to suck up to her because he didn't have any money, and being betrayed occasionally. These were very damaged men, and Charles II was very cynical. And one of the interesting things about him is we look back, and Charles I is sort of despised as we look back. Oh, this man, he lost the Civil War, divine right, kingship, and all that. Charles II, we think, oh, he's rather jolly. He's rather jolly. All those mistresses, the merry monarch. He sounds, he's not a silly Billy, divine right king, and all that. Well, what we forget is that Charles I was loved. Many, many people loved Charles I, and many died for Charles I. Charles II was not loved. He was not a loved king. He was not a loved man. People disliked his cynicism, and both in every aspect of his life, really. If he wasn't able to impose a divine right kingship, it was because he wasn't able to, not because he wouldn't have perfectly liked to. As in France, Louis XIV was becoming more authoritarian. Charles would certainly have gone the same way, given half a chance.
Well, his younger brother then, James, he seems to have made so many. I know we're looking back at we know now what they didn't know then, but he always seems to have made so many blunders that you could have seen miles off. Am I wrong in thinking that?
Well, I think there was a sort of collapse. He sort of collapsed at the end, which is interesting because he was a very brave soldier and a rather good soldier before he became king, when he was in France as a young man. And he had many qualities. I think people think of James as, because he converted, as being very religious or whatever. People forget that he was an even bigger shagger or swordsman or whatever you would like to call it than Charles II as a young man. I mean, he was notorious, slept with everything that moved. And again, I think, a very sort of very damaged individual, and one that make mistakes. Interestingly, Charles and perhaps James weren't the sort of canny political operators that, say, Henrietta Maria could be. Henrietta Maria could be very sort of flexible and was prepared to make friends with all sorts of people and alliances with all sorts of people. And in the 1630s, people often aren't aware that she was a leader of the sort of Puritan court faction. James, not as able. Too much of his father in him, I suppose.
So, okay, there are a few more Stuarts, but we don't have to delve into them. But these are the ones that are most interesting. One thing perhaps you can clear up for me. And I guess when I first came across the Civil War would have been when I was about 9 or 10 watching the film Cromwell. And in that film, Alec Guinness plays Charles I with a sort of slight kind of Edinburgh or border burr. Would Charles have had a very sort of slight Scottish accent?
I believe he did, actually, because, and the reason, of course, he left Scotland when he was tiny. I can't remember exactly how old. I think he was like 18 months old. Anyway, very small, maybe 3 years. Anyway, however old he was very, very tiny. And so you would have thought, why would he have a Scottish accent? He was brought up large in England. But again, like I was saying about James, who he was careful who he surrounded his children with, because he wanted everyone to have a piece of the cake, basically. And Charles was surrounded by Scots, lot of Scottish servants, and in his letters and so forth, of course, a lot of it's written phonetically. He does have a slight Scottish accent. So yes, I think he probably did have a mild Scots burr. So I think that was probably correct.
Did you think the Guinness portrayal was in any way accurate?
Do you know, I honestly can't remember it now. But he would have been, yes. But I'm afraid I honestly can't remember it now.
He flows around with a sort of cane and impressive clothes, which I presume Charles I would have.
Charles was a natty dresser. Charles liked beauty, but I think but Charles was also very physical. He wasn't a fay. He wasn't a fop. That would be a great mistake to think that. He was physically small, but extremely tough. I mean, so he walked very, very quickly, so quickly that people said had to run to keep up with him. He was a very good horseman, as his father was. People say, but he had stunted, and as a child, he had problems walking and so forth. Well, his father had problems walking as well. I think too much emphasis is placed on this, and the reason is the old reason of we associate disability with sin. And you think that now we don't do that anymore. Yes, maybe in the past, like Richard III and his humpback, but we most certainly do it now. And so if you saw the film Wonder Woman, you would see Wonder Woman looking beautiful in her little girl pants, and you would see her enemy, another woman, Dr. Poison, is disfigured. And so we still use this as shorthand to this day, and disabled actors are beginning to complain about it, quite rightly. So Charles is often depicted as, this sort of weak child. And the suggestion is that he was physically weak as a child, so he's mentally weak as an adult. It's disgusting, really, that we still do that. But I'm afraid we do. And it's also rubbish. He was a tough little chap. Interestingly, in the SAS, it's different, of course. Officers and men. Officers do, I think, brief tours in the SAS, whereas men stay. The men stay, you know, for a decade or whatever, years and years and years. And they are often quite small men, small, strong men. If you're a big chap, actually, you have to lug your own weight around, apart from anything else. So again, it's a mistake to think because you're, you know, short rather than tall, that you're in any way physically weak or foppish or anything like that.
Yes, I think it's a very important point you make there, actually. Although I'm very saddened you've watched Wonder Woman and not Cromwell recently.
I know. I have seen. Yes, I must watch it again, actually. Yes, because actually film is so important at bringing people to history and fiction as well, novels. I mean, the danger is that people... The funny thing is that one thing I have noticed is that fiction also feeds into history, which becomes very dangerous. So people pick up ideas from fiction.
Yes, I watched La Reine Margot.
Yes.
And which I love. So listeners, a great French film. And in it, Henri of Navarre, played by Daniel Auteuil, the fantastic French actor, is not the Henri of Navarre that I've been reading up about, and the one you've described, i.e. he's in the film, I think, forced to convert on the night of the St. Bartholomew's massacre or something. It was a hugely powerful film for me. I mean, there's so much blood in it anyway, but it really did influence my view of the wars of religion in France.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think it does. And in one of my books, I write about Lady Jane Grey and her sisters. And there's a very famous French picture, actually, but painted in the 19th century, of Jane Grey on the scaffold. With
yes.
and so forth. And then there's this awful sort of crooked historian, inverted commas, does this book about Jane, and he invents this description of her, saying that he sort of found this document in sort of Genoa or something, describing her as small with red hair and freckles. And this description is then used in every subsequent biography of Jane Grey, completely invented, taken largely from painting, and also invented very recently. That's the other thing. It's interesting. But that's not to say I'm extremely pro historical novels, historical films, love them myself. And they're what bring people. Often they bring people to history.
One figure we've not mentioned, this my last question for you really, is Mary Queen of Scots, who is, yes, you know, the sort of matriarch of all the Stuart monarchs of England. She's often presented quite negatively, really, isn't she?
She's sort of romanticized, isn't she? Do you think she's presented negatively? I suppose, yes.
I guess until recently, until the last sort of 10 years, I suppose.
Yeah.
Maybe Me Too has had something to do with that. I don't know. The new film with Elizabeth and Mary, the one that came out about 5 or 6 years ago, was much more positive about that.
Yes, I mean, do you think she's sort of perceived as sort of weak and silly? I don't know.
And also the sort of classic trope of deceitful femme fatale as well against her cousin, Elizabeth.
Yes, I find that quite extraordinary, because of course she was the one stuck in. She was just trying to come through England, and her fellow queen had her locked up. I mean, to be fair on Elizabeth did not want this. I mean, because Elizabeth realized it wasn't very good for her to have a monarch locked up and then beheaded. And she was persuaded by William Cecil to keep her locked up. And then she was persuaded to have her executed. But right up to the very end, Elizabeth actually tried very hard to have Mary murdered, which is the traditional way of disposing of a fallen monarch, which is what Mary was. It's the traditional way of doing it, and Elizabeth wanted to do it, and she asked for it to be done, for her to be murdered. And if she was Henry VIII, I'm sure Mary would have been murdered. But interestingly, Elizabeth did not have that power, and they would not murder her. They would not, and they insisted on having Mary tried and executed, which was not great for any monarch to have that happen. And of course, it foreshadowed the execution of Charles I. I mean, yes. They said at the time, they used the argument, they said that Scotland was subject to England, and therefore Mary was in some sense Elizabeth's subject. But this was obviously untrue. Scotland was an independent kingdom. Mary was an independent queen. She was in no sense Elizabeth's subject. She was simply a ruling monarch, a queen regnant who had her head chopped off, was tried and executed. And then, of course, this happened to Charles.
It is tragic when you look at what happened to Charles as well, but
Well, tragic. I mean, yes. I mean, I suppose. Yes. Tragedy is, isn't it? Is is that your weaknesses lead to your demise? I suppose that's true of Charles. Although James does deserve more attention, and it'll be interesting to see if how well this new series does about it's about Buckingham. It is drawn from a book which I'm afraid to say I did review at some point and was not terribly good. I mean, I'm afraid, but that doesn't mean that the program won't be great fun and bring a lot of people to history.
Right. Well, yes, we'll have to see. Leanda, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much for listening. As you heard there, the Film Club will continue this month with a John Kennedy double bill. 13 Days, directed by Roger Donaldson, and the big one, JFK, directed by Oliver Stone. Please do rate, review and subscribe, but until then, thank you and good night.